Yeah, we get views on the YouTube channel. So believe it or not, the first thing I wanted to talk about with holiday hazards really doesn't have as much to do with, things you might encounter like foods. It's people. And I think this is the one thing that's often overlooked is that you have a tremendous number of friends and family that may be trafficking through your home during the holidays, Thanksgiving, New Year's, Christmas, etc. And everything from not paying attention to where the animals are and letting them escape through an open door to not watching the food on their plate when the dog is roaming around, to leaving trash someplace where it's easy accessible, to coming into your home and staying and leaving medication or even things like gummies around that your dog could have access to. You can look online and you can see all these things. Oh, avoid these foods, avoid that foods. But at the end of the day, most of the time, I don't want to use the word carelessness, but it's a lack of awareness on the part of people who are not familiar with your home and the pets that are in it. It's one thing if you have a friend come over, they know your dogs, they know the routine, the dog door can't be open, the dog will escape. But for those people who are not used to being at your home or people who are not used to staying at your home, it's kind of like a 24/7 responsibility you're asking of them, and they're not used to it. So, we'll talk about certain specific foods, but, food left out on a plate, the dog comes and jumps on the couch, jumps on the counter to get it. The trash, they leave their trash or they leave an exposed trash open or they discard something in the trash. Dare I say one of the biggest things would be really medications. And I'm not just talking about prescription, but let's face it, people have got gummies and so forth. And, while THC doesn't usually kill, it has a really long half-life in dogs and they'll be stoned for days and need care. And it's not ideal. It's not pleasant, but, and of course, there's that whole other thing with respect to getting out and about. I mean, if you haven't heard about it, obviously microchips have been around forever and they're great, but a lot of days you can actually buy these collars where you can attach an Apple AirTag. So you can track them in real time. There are other devices, things you can buy like on Amazon that'll do the same thing. But if you have an iPhone, it's fabulous, it's integrated, it's inexpensive. So you can actually attach an AirTag. And if they do escape, you can see where they are in real time. So I think that the friends and family consideration is really the first and foremost the thing. And it sounds crazy, but if you have guests over for the whole weekend, you can't lock your animals up the whole weekend. It's not realistic. But having a conversation, say, hey, look, my dogs will steal food. My dogs will dig through the trash. My dogs don't need your gummies. My dogs may eat your blood pressure medication if you're leaving it on the counter. And, these are all things that people don't think about. But, you taking blood pressure medication, for example, and taking an extra pill may not be an issue. But your dog, let's say your hypothetical 25-pound dog who takes the same amount of medication may have a serious issue. And so people need to be wary of that fact and be aware of their surroundings. But of course, the first thing I was going to mention is the trash. Traditionally, we like to say, well, Thanksgiving, everybody has turkey and there's gravy and it's a fat, heavy meal. And so one of the greatest risks is what we call pancreatitis or an inflamed pancreas. And this is sort of the poster child holiday for this condition. In actual fact, it's not something we see very often, but the idea is you ingest a huge fatty meal and your pancreas responds and reacts in an inappropriate way. And all those digestive enzymes the pancreas produces, rather than just being dumped into the gut to work on food, they start to attack your own tissues. That's the classic presentation you read about a textbook. In reality, most of the time dogs get pancreatitis and it has less to do with what they eat, but that's a greater risk, if you will. If you're eating or if you're around fat-laden foods. Let's be honest, Thanksgiving is not exactly a waist-thinning holiday for most of us. But then, of course, eating anything out of the trash, the vomiting, the diarrhea, the gastroenteritis. I think I've been asked the question, well, what can I do to sort of head off this possibility or probability? And unfortunately, you keep them away from easy access. You can't even say things like probiotics or prebiotics will, sort of mute the possibility of a reaction. But, the other thing I'd point out is, many of us give food to our pets from the table, things we eat regularly. But Thanksgiving is a special day. So the spices, some of the foods, the flavors, things that they may not be used to could also potentially trigger a more significant response than what you might otherwise experience if they had, rice and chicken, for example, that you were eating on a particular night. I think if we're speaking strictly about Thanksgiving and some of the more traditional foods, I think obviously, I mean, the first thing is the gravy, because it is so fat laden, and that's hard to digest. And even if it doesn't produce pancreatitis, you could still get a nasty sort of system upset with vomiting and diarrhea. At the same time, one of the culprits I do every couple of years here about is the carcass. The turkey carcass. You're carving the turkey carcass, it's on the counter, or you go to discard it, but you discard it in the trash can by the counter in the kitchen, not in the garage or on the curb. And of course, when nobody's around, the dog gets into the carcass. It's kind of funny, because if you think about sort of the ancestral dogs or wild dogs, they'll eat and grind bone. Their jaws are well equipped to actually crushing them. And in many cases, dogs may eat chicken bones, turkey bones, and do the same thing. But then there's always the possibility of bones splintering or getting stuck or puncturing something. And so that's always a consideration that one needs to factor in. Now, one thing that gets a little press, and I think you do see it's around the Thanksgiving sort of holidays, is raisins. The raisins came on scene. Raisins and grapes, I should say, came on scene a number of years ago as a toxic food, if you will, or potentially toxic food for some dogs. And raisins can be found in stuffings. They can be found in a lot of desserts, and we don't necessarily think about them. But it probably is one of those things I would be more concerned about. You hear about sometimes onions or things like macadamia nuts. Realistically, those things are not going to be as much of an issue, if you will, as if a dog eats a whole fistful of raisins, if you will. During any of the holidays, obviously we always talk about chocolate. And I think that the most important thing people need to recognize about chocolate is it's not just the ingestion of chocolate. It's the amount, you have to look at the type of chocolate. You have to look at not just the type, but you also have to look at the size of the dog that's ingesting it. And that's because different types of chocolates have different amounts of the toxic chemical called theobromine. The darker the chocolate, the more of that compound is present. To illustrate this, you could say, well, if I have your average 80-pound Labrador and my 80-pound Labrador eats a Hershey bar, realistically, there's not enough of the toxic chemical to really do anything. Sure, there may be a little vomiting and diarrhea, but at best, that's all you're going to deal with. Conversely, that same 80-pound Labrador who eats, let's say, a brick or a block of Baker's chocolate, really dark chocolate, that potentially poses a risk. And you can find all sorts of, toxicity calculators online where you put in your dog's weight and you estimate the amount of chocolate that was ingested and the type of chocolate, and it'll tell you, is my dog faced with potentially eating a, I don't want to say toxic or lethal dose. I mean, if it's excessive, it could lead to that, but a dose that could cause a problem. On the more mild end, a little bit of vomiting and diarrhea. As we sort of ramp up the dose ingested, then you worry about, cardiovascular, even some neurologic side effects that can occur. And obviously those are much more of a concern. So, there's all sorts of chocolate decadence around during the holiday season. Chocolate is a concern, but again, it's all relative to the size of the patient and the type of chocolate. Take white chocolate, for example. White chocolate doesn't have any cocoa powder in it. The toxic compound we're talking about is found in cocoa powder. Therefore, you could, in theory, feed white chocolate because it doesn't have any of that cocoa powder or theobromine present. But again, people are baking. So darker chocolates, baking chocolates, they're around. You take a 20-pound dog who eats just a couple of squares of baking chocolate, and then you're looking at the possibility of, a more significant or severe problem. I think sort of as an aside, I'd point out that, while we're, here Friday and, the day after Thanksgiving, the evening of Thanksgiving, if there's a concern, the ASPCA maintains their sort of poison control website, which is open 24/7. You can call them and say, hey, this is the situation. My dog ate this, my dog ate that. Here's my dog's size. How should I approach this? And of course, there are urgent care ERs that are available to address that if necessary. I don't often push people to sort of make their own dogs vomit, although you can using hydrogen peroxide, but it can be a messy or difficult proposition, and not many people want to take on that challenge. So now, it's funny, we get into sort of like, the Christmas, Hanukkah season, and the things that we always, that I personally sometimes think a little bit more about are the dangers to cats at times than dogs, although, there are considerations on both sides. The One of the first things, which I don't think people necessarily give a lot of credence to, are wire hazards. Young dogs, puppies, even cats, when you're putting together a Christmas tree, there's a lot of wires and attachments they're not used to seeing. It can be pretty traumatic if a dog or a cat bites into a live wire. You can buy, protective coverings, places like Home Depot, Lowe's, and even Best Buy has them so that the wires are encased in like a little plastic tube to minimize the risk. But, on occasion, we do see a pet, usually it's a younger dog or perhaps a cat who will gnaw on these things. And it can be severe, it can be life-threatening. It's forgive the expression, it is quite a jolt to the body. And, oftentimes we can see these patients experiencing a lot of trauma to the respiratory system, which, can take their life. Plant-wise, during the holiday season, I think there's kind of three things that we need to worry about. Mistletoe, both for dogs and cats, can be something that causes a lot of GI upset. So vomiting, diarrhea, the berries too, that, are sometimes attached. Holly is another one. Holly has that sort of sharp pointed leaf, and you think, well, is that something they'd really want to gnaw on? Well, there are those out there who so indiscriminate that they would consider gnawing on it. From the perspective of dogs, I think more so than cats, at the base of a tree, oftentimes you have a water-filled dish and you'll have additives, to keep the tree healthy. Well, some of those additives can be quite toxic. Now, again, we're not necessarily talking about life-threatening toxicity, but severe vomiting or diarrhea around the holidays is something that nobody wants to have to deal with or without company in the house. The thing that, it's funny, you sort of, as I said, we talk about, cat risks. And admittedly, at least for me, it's been a few years since I've seen this, but my God, tinsel is like manna from heaven from a cat. They can play with it and they can ingest it. And, it's sort of it's a metallic ribbon. And, I'm sure plenty of people have messed with it. It doesn't tear or break very easily. It takes a fair amount of force to sort of stretch to break it. And so cats will ingest it, or they'll ingest it attached to something else, and it gets stuck. And the problem is it can have like a saw-like effect. Having seen this before surgically, I mean, I can tell you how damaging it actually can be. Oftentimes, they can even get it stuck sort of underneath of the base of the tongue, but it travels, and you'd be surprised how much of this they can ingest and how damaging it can be. So, tinsel is one of the things, but it goes also to this idea of when you're decorating a tree. One of the other things we talk about is, kids make ornaments. Grandkids make ornaments. They can make them out of, yeast-free doughs. You can buy ornaments, that have chocolate or candies inside. Now that might not be such a draw for a cat, but certainly for a dog, yeah, could be an issue. I don't know if you remember, there's a famous scene in National Lampoon's Christmas Vacation where there's like I don't know, the cat gets wind. Well, the cat bites the wire and gets cooked. But at some point, I think there's a raccoon or whatever in the tree, and it just wreaks havoc. And so, you don't want your cat moving through the tree, or small dog, because that could lead to a whole mess of problems. But sometimes people don't think about that. The ornaments themselves can be attractive. And along the same, lines, gift giving, whether it's, say people putting something in a stocking underneath a tree on the counter, but a gift that has, a kid's toy that has a scent to it, that might have chocolates or other types of candies or treats. We may not be able to appreciate the odor, but dogs have much more sensitive noses. And so having those up and away, so they're not easily accessible is key. But sometimes people don't think about that. It's like, well, it's in a box, the box is wrapped, the dog's not going to bother with it. But, they use dogs at the border to search for drugs that are buried deep in trucks because their sense of smell is just that good. So I point that in mind. But yeah, I mean, the whole, anything that kids bring home that's made out of, I think they're like yeast-free doughs or even Play-Doh. You may say, well, okay, is my dog really going to eat Play-Doh? I mean, how tasty is it? Well, kids eat Play-Doh. I mean, when they're kids. And so, yeah, you can expect a dog that has easy access to it could do the same thing. And the problem is, it could be almost have like a brick-like consistency once it dries, both the dough and or the Play-Doh, and that can get stuck. The body's not going to be in a position to break that down and pass it easily. If it's a solid brick, at the time it's brought home, it's going to probably be a solid brick if it's ingested and could cause an obstruction. And that's nothing somebody wants to experience during the holidays. Another one, timely both for the holidays, Hanukkah, Christmas, and even for, I suppose, certain folks during Thanksgiving, are candles. Cats are usually discriminating, but cats roaming on counters when there's a lot of noise, trying to get away from the dog, or a kid that's chasing it, may not be as dexterous or agile as they could. Knocking over a candle is not a good thing. Same thing with dogs, especially with things like scented candles. People who have fruit flavored candles or food flavored candles. Dogs don't necessarily know that it's wax, and they don't necessarily know that it's lit until it's too late. While I've never actually seen a dog like burned in the face, the bigger concern is really, having the candle obviously, ignite something that shouldn't ignite. One thing, that I wanted to mention too, and we sort of talked a little bit about it, and I think more people are aware of it because it's sort of out in the ethos and has been for a while, but sugar-free desserts. There's a compound and what they call a sugar alcohol called xylitol. You find it in a lot of sugar-free gums. You can find it in a lot of sugar-free products for diabetics. This is one of those things that has very real consequences in terms of the way it can adversely affect the liver. It's something that we don't see a lot of, admittedly. But again, it's another consideration. Somebody comes into the home, they've got gum or candy that they're eating, they leave out. They don't think, well, the dog wouldn't touch this because, it's gum, it's wrapped up. Or even other types of say, even, baked goods or candies somebody might buy to entertain. Some of these things that have xylitol in it can be quite a concern. And again, just like with chocolate, you're going to have to look at how much is ingested, relative to the size of the dog. But at the end of the day, just like with grapes, you don't have to ingest a pound of grapes or a pound of xylitol to have an adverse reaction or a real problem. There are going to be those patients who are more exquisitely sensitive. We don't necessarily know who they are in advance, irregardless of size. And so, any of these artificial sweeteners are things that we should not be giving our pets on a regular basis. Just like, sure, is it the end of the world if you give your 80-pound Labrador a little square of Hershey's chocolate? No, but it could be a very big problem if you give your 10-pound Chihuahua a piece of Baker's chocolate. So just something to sort of food for thought there. I think as far as like specific risks to the holidays, that probably covers the majority of them. Again, when it comes to kids' toys, you have to consider, well, especially for younger kids, where they have scented toys or they have toys that might mimic, something in the kitchen. Even simple things like these stickers that we, used to have as kids that have a scent like grape or fruit. All of these things could potentially be attractive to dogs. So, and of course, a wrapped gift. What does a wrapped gift usually have around it? Ribbon, tinsel, something, some decorative element, which in and of itself could be a problem when they're tearing through it. So, this isn't sort of revolutionary information. Obviously, there's a lot out about there, but I think this idea that people, friends and family, they're really the biggest concern. If you can somehow manage to educate, advise, cajole your friends and family, I think you have a much better chance of sort of weathering the holidays with fewer incidents. But again, you never know. As a general rule, cats are more predictable in the sense that they're more discriminating, so they stay away from things that don't look or smell good and wouldn't push past, say, the wrapping on a gift to get to some food item that's wrapped up. But I know in a heartbeat, my Airedale Rosie wouldn't even hesitate to tear through something with just a hint of an odor. So I would have you bear that in mind. But those are the things I kind of wanted to mention. Again, certainly there are potentially, a slew of other hazards, but I think that sort of encompasses most of the common things that, more people are likely to have to deal with over the holidays. And I suppose one could even make a deal with guests, friends, and family. Say, hey, if you leave something out and my dog ends up in the ER, that's your bill that you're responsible for. It's not mine. I don't know if that would incentivize people to be more conscientious, but you know, talking with them, keeping your pets away when people are eating their meals until food is all cleaned up, keeping them away from food prep stations, I think is it's just a safety measure that's worth considering to minimize the possibility they get into something that they should. So
Great
question.
advice, Josh. I mean, you don't think about it. It is the people because you can't control that all the time.
No,
I
you
didn't
you
think about it.
can't.
I've been how many
No, I
holidays
mean,
you've been
somebody
through.
comes to your home, they're not
Yeah,
familiar that your cat likes to jet out the door. And of course, they leave the screen
exactly.
door open, or you have multiple people coming in and out of the house, and somebody
Right.
leaves, their hands are full with the drinks. They forget to close the screen door, and before you
Yeah.
know it, the dog is out the front door. So these are just
Yeah.
things
Good
you need to be
advice.
aware of. But yeah, this
So
whole
let's
guide,
say our animals, I guess, what are the steps? So let's say they ate the turkey carcass,
right?
but you didn't notice that till later, but your dog seems okay, I guess. Do you just monitor or do you immediately, once you find out, go to the ER or the urgent care and get them
It kind
checked
of
out?
depends. I mean, as far as getting those things out of them, after a few hours, a lot of this material can pass through the stomach into the small intestine and beyond, and therefore we're not getting it out by inducing vomiting. Um, Obviously, it very much depends on what we're talking about. I think
Yeah.
if it's any of these ingredients that potentially have a toxic effect, so things like the xylitol, chocolate or raisins, I think if you suspect ingestion, I think the first thing, especially if it's after hours, is to call the ASPCA's, poison hotline, because they
Okay.
can, they're veterinarians you'll speak with. They'll talk you through the process. Okay, based on your dog size, based on what you suspect they ingested, this is what you should do. And they may tell you, hey, you know what? There's really not a concern here other than a little vomiting and diarrhea, and therefore don't worry about it.
Okay.
Obviously, you can call the urgent cares, you can call the ERs in the evening. But I will tell you that if you're calling about, let's say, raisin ingestion, they're going to insist that you call the ASPCA, because what the ASPCA veterinarian or toxicologist will do is come up with a plan that urgent care center was likely to use to manage the case going forward. So that's one of the services they provide, and they'll give you a case number that can be referenced to get that information. As far as things like turkey carcasses and so forth, after a few hours, you may not be able to do a lot. Sometimes under some circumstances, I'll say, well, let's continue to feed these dogs and let's kind of get a lot of food in their system and see if we can't sort of use all this food to create some momentum to kind of push everything along.
Yeah.
But there are those circumstances where after Thanksgiving, Sunday afternoon, they suddenly lose interest in food, they become lethargic, and the vomiting starts. And then you sort of have to say,
Okay.
well, could this be an extension of something that happened earlier? Bottom line is, sure, timing is everything. After a few hours, even our ability to get them to vomit is going to be somewhat limited. And I think the best thing you could do, other than contacting folks like the ESPC, is know what they could have got into and how long ago. So when you call to get information, those are those tidbits they're going to need to make a recommendation for you.
Okay. Thank you.
You're welcome. Well, where we're at if you need anything, and I want you to have a happy, healthy holidays with your grandmother.
Thank you. Thank you.
And if you have any other
Appreciate
questions,
that.
give us a call.
Sounds great, Josh. Happy holidays.
Thank you, you too.
Bye.